Hey guys, welcome to your very first pre-recorded lecture for, in this case, viruses. This is topic 1. I want to give you a little bit of advice on how to handle these lectures. In each of these cases, I will be giving you some kind of worksheet or outline that you should have downloaded and printed out, or have it up on your computer and fill it out while you are watching these lectures. That's going to be the document that I will use to write quizzes and to write exams. So make sure you utilize those outlines or worksheets. So the other thing I want to tell you is that some of these lectures for viruses, I recorded them in the spring for my organismal biology class. So sometimes I'll refer to your textbook, but it really won't be your textbook because you don't have one. Or it will refer to an assignment that you have coming up, but it won't be an assignment that you have coming up because it's a different class. So that's only really going to be the case for the viruses lectures. If something sounds like it doesn't make sense because it's referring to something you don't know about, then that's okay, just ignore it. But if you have questions, obviously you can send me an email to ask me. Okay, so this first lecture, I've split this into several parts, and so the first one is just going to be about whether or not viruses are alive, and you probably remember that from the Probing Your Knowledge quiz. And it's not that simple of an answer whether or not they are alive. If you look at these characteristics right here, these are characteristics of living things taken from a textbook. They include order, which is basically a particular structure of an organism that's designed in a specific way. Living things have chemical instructions that determine what that thing is, and that can be either DNA or RNA. Living things have metabolic activities like cellular respiration, which is basically burning sugar for energy, or photosynthesis is another example of a metabolic activity. They have energy flow, which means they take in food or they do photosynthesis. They have some way of getting energy. They use the energy, and they have waste products. Living things have homeostasis. This is another characteristic of living things, which means they maintain certain solute balances or water balances within their bodies. They can reproduce, and they are prone to evolutionary adaptation. So these are all characteristics of living things. And the reason why the question of whether or not viruses are alive is not a simple one is because they can do some of these things, and there are other things that they cannot do. So some lifelike characteristics that viruses have, and some of these images that I'm showing are just different types of viruses, which you'll learn about in the videos coming up. So some of the lifelike characteristics of viruses are they are subject to evolution. So that means that their genetic material over time can change. They can have mutations that can accumulate. They are able to reproduce, although this is a little bit iffy because they can't reproduce on their own. They do have genetic material, either DNA or RNA. They have genes and proteins. These things were not specifically listed as characteristics of living things, but they are sort of inherent in some of the other traits that were listed in the slide just before this. And one thing that's sort of like a behavior is that viruses can bind to other cells. So it sounds like they are sort of behaving in a specific way that seems kind of lifelike. But some definitions of living things, the main tenet of being a living thing, according to definitions in potentially the textbook you're reading or the online text you're reading and other textbooks, is reproduction with gene-controlled heredity is the most basic attribute of life. So reproduction is the thing that a lot of people latch on to as to whether or not something is a living thing. Okay, so here I say that viruses can reproduce. So are they alive? Well, there's a lot of non-lifelike characteristics of viruses too. This is a different virus. You can see it's shaped very differently from the one that I just showed you a second ago. They do not have metabolism, so they don't burn energy, they don't take in energy, they don't have any type of excretion, which is listed down here. So they don't get rid of waste products. They are not able to maintain anything about inside of their structure versus outside of their structure, so there's no maintenance of water balance or anything like that. They don't respond to stimuli. They cannot take in energy. So there's all of these things that are sort of required for living things that viruses cannot do. So if we were to go back to that major list that I showed you initially, yes, they do have particular structure. So this part, they qualify. They have chemical instructions in the form of DNA and RNA, but they can't do metabolic activities. They do not have energy flow. They don't take in any energy. They can't do homeostasis. They kind of do reproduction. We're going to talk about this a little bit more in one of the next videos, but they cannot do reproduction on their own. They have to have a host cell or host organism. And they can undergo evolutionary adaptation. So there's some things they can do that are lifelike and some things that they can't do. So there are many ways to sort of describe this. Some textbooks describe it as a borrowed life. What a virus is, it's typically not considered a living thing. It's considered an infectious particle that has genes that are packaged in proteins. So it's basically a protein coat with genes inside. The genes can either be RNA or DNA. They are way more simple than even the most basic cells, prokaryotic cells, so they're way more basic than bacteria. And bacteria are the most simple cells that exist. And they can't reproduce or carry out metabolism outside of the host cell. So they need a host cell to do any of those really crucial things that would qualify them as living. They cannot do it on their own. So they exist in this area that's sort of in between living and non-living things, and it can be considered a borrowed life. In some contexts, they're living, but they need another living thing in order to carry out those characteristics that would make them alive. So let me just be clear. Typically, viruses are not considered living things, even though they have some lifelike characteristics. Here's a few images of viruses that I wanted to show you. Here, it looks like it's viruses budding off of other viruses, but what this actually is, these are viruses right here, and they are leaving animal cells. So this larger structure here is an animal cell, this larger structure here is an animal cell, and you can see these smaller little structures are sort of budding off of the animal cells. The viruses are using these cells to reproduce, and then a bunch of viruses are leaving them. So this is obviously just a drawing, but if you were to see an up-close picture of a human immune cell infected with HIV, this huge thing is the human immune cell, and every one of these little specks is a virus. So you can see how tiny they are, and all of these HIV viruses that are coming off of the cell is actually budding off all of these little viruses. So it's helping to produce all of them. So you can see it's millions of them, or thousands at least. So the next video will discuss virus structure. And that's it.